The next session is a conversation with Professor Joseph Nye, 2022, how the U.S. and Japan should deal with China's offensive. First, I would like to introduce the members of the panel on the stage. From the right-hand side, we have Ms. Catherine Hill, Greater China Correspondent, Financial Times. She is based in Taipei. Professor Joseph Nye, Jr., University Distinguished Service Professor, Emeritus, Harvard University. And Mr. Hiroyuki Akita, commentator with Nikkei. Now, at this point in time, I would like to hand over to Mr. Akita. Thank you very much. This is going to be the last session. First, very wonderful members are here for this session. Regarding Professor Nye, there is no need for introduction. Soft power, smart power, that concept was created by him in the long historical context. He has been analyzing international relationship. On the other hand, Ms. Hill is now looking at China as a whole, but also, in addition to that, she is the bureau chief of Moscow. So she has been very much looking at Russia as well. So we have a diversity of members here. Actually, original plan was to have Mr. Armitage, former Deputy Secretary of State, and with Ms. Hill and I myself, we're going to ask questions to Mr. Armitage and Professor Nye, but unfortunately, he was unable to come. But I have asked very direct questions in advance to Mr. Armitage. The U.S. and China, are they going to go to war? And how could we stop that from happening? That was the burning question for me, and he's going to give us a response in the video message, which will last about 5 minutes. And based on that, we would like to start a conversation. Now, let's listen to Mr. Armitage.
Well, good day, NIKKEI, and to the audience. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I've always enjoyed it in the past. Today, I've been asked two questions. The first question is whether Xi Jinping might go to war with the United States over Taiwan or some other factors. And the second question is what the U.S. and our allies can do to obviate that possibility. I think the most important thing for all of us is, first of all, leadership. Leadership of Prime Minister Kishida, leadership of President Biden, and to emulate the leadership that Mr. Abe showed, where a true leader is both a prophet and a statesman. And Mr. Abe was prophetic in the early 90s, knowing about the need for Taiwan's defense and its effect on the defense of Japan. He was also prophetic on predicting a China which may not always play by the same rules that we all do. So, the first thing and the most important thing for us, I think, after exhibiting leadership in our respective regions and our respective areas of expertise, is to take inventory of our strengths. We are strong when we're together, economically, politically, culturally, and of course in military terms. I've already indicated in the past that I didn't think under present circumstances Xi Jinping would attack the United States. And the reason is right now he's got an awful lot of problems. He's got economic problems where his economy's in the tank. He's got problems of lack of water, no agriculture. He's not self-sufficient like Russia is in terms of agricultural products and energy. He's got lockdowns with COVID. So I think all in all, for a period of time, he'll not be as adventuresome as he might be. So this is all by way of saying that Xi Jinping is not 10 feet tall. But neither are Japan, the United States, and our allies 4 feet tall. We're quite formidable when we're all together. China is aware and does not like the Abe-Suri-Daijin formulation of a free and open Indo-Pacific. My view is this is a threat to none, benefits all, and if we stick with it and are faithful to our alliances and to our friends, then it may be the best opportunity to bring China into an understanding that she's much better off and benefits far more by playing by the same rules that we all do. And a free and open Indo-Pacific will do just that. We've got to continue to bring European nations into the Asian life. I very much salute Prime Minister Kishida's activities in NATO and the EU. It was noteworthy, his visits. And look what's happened. We've had the British, we've had the French, we've had the Germans, we've had the Canadians exercising with us in Asia. And I think this is to be commended. I think it's to be encouraged. And I think Japan and the United States can do our part to try to keep the European interest high in this. We should continue the activities begun by Mr. Abe and the Quad. Prime Minister Kishida, Prime Minister Albanese in Australia have just had security talks. I think they've developed a further relationship, and to the extent we have an interwoven fabric of security among our friends and allies, and we're much better off regarding the possibility of a China which becomes reckless in her security activities. We've got to continue our support for Taiwan, a Taiwan which has confidence to continue the economic and political and democratic road that they've traveled is one that will have, I think, the wherewithal to resist Chinese pressure, but also won't feel the need to declare independence, and will not give China that excuse for military activities against Taiwan. And finally, something that may surprise you a good bit, and that is that we should all continue our support for Ukraine. I note that Japan has recently reestablished your diplomatic presence in Kyiv. I hope this will be followed by even more humanitarian assistance. And the United States has continued. I think totally we've given $30 billion in humanitarian and security assistance to Ukraine. Now, why is this important when we're talking about Asia? It's very important to demonstrate to Xi Jinping that very often big countries lose because they don't win. And equally, smaller countries win because they don't lose. Any American service member can tell you about Afghanistan or Vietnam, and any member of the former Soviet Union can tell about their activities and their loss in Afghanistan. And finally, the last missing piece of the puzzle, and this is mostly for the United States, we've got to get back on the horse of trade agreements. Mr. Abe very helpfully kept the TPP alive, kept a place at the table for the United States, and I certainly hope the Biden administration will take note of that and start moving and inching towards that rightful place at the table. So I wish you best of luck in this, and I hope perhaps next year to be able to be there myself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let us start our discussion or conversation. This is the last session of the program. So the purpose of this session is perhaps up until now we had discussion and the major questions that arose. We are going to discuss those, and then Professor Nye's wisdom will be borrowed so that we can find some clue or solutions to those big questions. Perhaps there are many issues discussed, but at the end of the day, I think today's topic are twofold. I think one is about Ukraine. The Russia's aggression in Ukraine is continuing. Going forward, in what way this aggression will expand, the nuclear weapon taboo will be breached, and if that it happens, what would be the ramification to Japan and Asia? And secondly, as Mr. Armitage said, in Asia, particularly in Taiwan Straits, if China and the U.S. go to war, and there will be a major risk, how are we going to address such a possibility or such a risk? These are the two topics I want to address. First, from my part, I would like to focus on Ukraine, Russia's aggression, how this is going to affect us. Maybe 5 to 7 minutes. I want to invite Professor Nye to speak. And then I want to invite Ms. Hill to focus on China, maybe 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And then once again, I will take over at that time and the implications to Japan. And also I would like to ask several questions from the floor. Thank you.
早速ですが、
So without further ado, Professor Nye, in Ukraine, the Russia's aggression against Ukraine, as we discussed just now, maybe in some cases, in 1945, Hiroshima, Nagasaki created a nuclear taboo. Maybe that could be breached, and also NATO may retaliate against Russia for the use of nuclear weapons. Even if without retaliation, there will be a lot of ramification. However, if there is a retaliation, then this is going to be a full-fledged war. I participated in security war the other day, and that was a real topic. We had more reality there. Now, the question is, how should we view this situation? Particularly, we had a long history so far, and how dangerous are we now? And where are we trying to move?
Well, the war in Ukraine is something which very few people expected. And that means that if we weren't very good at predicting its beginning, we may not be very good at predicting its ending either. If I look at the question that you asked, I think and try to think about how this could end, I think there's several possibilities. One, which is least likely, is that Putin cuts his losses and says that he's not getting anywhere and he'd better find some way to find a face-saving way and get out. I doubt that Putin's thinking that way. To go back to something Jim Steinberg said, the great danger on these things is mirror imaging. We expect the opponent to think the way we do, and actually you have to think about the way the opponent does. And since Putin's basic motivation on this was that of a great Russian chauvinist who never accepted the legitimacy of Ukraine as a state, and I think, you know, that the idea that Putin say, "I'll cut my losses," seems to me not likely. The second possibility would be what I call a dirty deal, in which as the lights go out and Germans are freezing in the dark and sometime in the middle of the winter, they persuade other Europeans and then eventually push hard on the Americans to get Ukraine to accept some sort of return to the lines before February 24th, which means Ukraine would give up half of the Donbass as well as Crimea. I think that's also not very likely, because even if Putin never believed that there was a Ukrainian nation, he has essentially created it. And what we have is a situation where it'd be very hard for Zelensky to say, you now own 20% of my country, I'll settle for 10%. I'm not sure that that's a plausible negotiated outcome. A third possibility is that you have what sometimes used to be called a a frozen conflict. I think it'd be better to describe it as a simmering conflict, which means that the actual shooting and shelling slows down or might even stop temporarily, but Putin could turn it up anytime he wants. And if Putin wants to destroy the legitimacy of an effective Ukrainian state, that may be his best option. Essentially is to keep Ukraine so much on edge that it can't properly recover. Unfortunately, of the three options, and I'll discuss the nuclear as a fourth possibility, I think that's probably the most likely. And the fourth option, of course, is nuclear use, in which Putin, feeling cornered and sees this situation in Ukraine as an existential threat to himself, even if not to Russia, but he declares it an existential threat to Russia and decides to try to change the balance. I mean, the most modest way of doing this, if there's anything that's modest about it, is what Gary Ruffhead suggested, which is you explode a nuclear device over the Black Sea as a way to shock the Ukrainians or the West into finding something like the dirty deal. Alternatively, he may say, I'm going to try to use it as a tactical weapon on the battlefield to destroy these Ukrainian units which are essentially pushing me out of Kherson or other places. And there you have the fact that if he does that, it's not clear it's going to work as he expects. But in addition to that, it might have, in addition to breaking the nuclear taboo, which I'm not sure Putin cares that much about, but what Putin describes as an existential threat may not be seen as an existential threat by Defense Minister Shoigu or Gerasimov, the head of the military, and so forth. And it's plausible that under those extreme circumstances, when Putin gives the order to use nuclear weapons, because he sees the loss in Ukraine as an existential threat to himself, Shoigu and Gerasimov may say using nuclear weapons could be an existential threat to what we care most about, which is the military and our institution. So different people rate this use of nuclear weapons with different levels of subjective probability. I have a colleague who I respect at Harvard who says he thinks the chances are 1 in 5 or 20%. In discussing this with him, I said, I think the chances are much lower than that, maybe 1 in 100, 1%. In either case, it's much too high. But I do think that of the four options that I described as the way this might end, the simmering conflict is probably the highest probability. Not a happy outcome or a happy prediction, but you wanted my best judgment. That's as much as I can guess. And let me reiterate that all of us are just guessing.
どうもありがとうございます。もう大変いくつかのパターン。
Thank you very much. Thank you for presenting to us several possible scenarios. I would like to ask you one short follow-up question. Authorities don't like to answer hypothetical questions. However, journalists want to ask you hypothetical questions. So if Russia uses nuclear weapons, breaking nuclear taboo, if that happens, maybe 10 years or 20 years, 30 years from now, historians, how do they evaluate this change to the international security architecture and international order in retrospect?
President Biden has said that he has warned Putin both publicly and privately that the use of nuclear weapons in any form will lead to severe consequences for Russia. He hasn't said, and I think it's a wise position, whether the response would be nuclear or non-nuclear, what it would be. But I would say that the nuclear taboo, which has been in place since 1945, is what my former colleague, the Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling, said, probably one of the most important norms that we've had in the world over the last period since World War II. And therefore, we have to respond strongly if it's broken at any of these levels of use, whether it's over the Black Sea or battlefield nuclear weapons, whatever. And so a strong response will be important. On the other hand, as the Americans and NATO look at how they respond, if they are thinking ahead for your 10-year historian's view, they ought to say, did we do our best to restore the nuclear taboo? If we restore in kind with a nuclear response, I think that may be the end of the nuclear taboo. If we respond in a way which uses conventional forces, but with extraordinary effects, I mean, you drop the Strait of Kerch Bridge, you basically obliterate a number of Russian units that are in Ukraine. You don't necessarily strike Russian territory as such, but you do such extreme damage to Russia through the use of conventional response that it's clear that breaking the nuclear taboo was, as Biden said, something that brought on severe consequences. But then the effort should be to, after that, to try to restore the nuclear taboo, to make it clear that by acting as strongly as we did, that we take very seriously that nuclear weapons, in the words of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be thought. Putin actually said that himself, but clearly it's not something which he holds near and dear to his heart. And I think trying to restore that should be the primary concern we have as we consider our response.
どうもありがとうございました。じゃあここからは
Thank you very much. At this point in time, I hand over to Ms. Hill, mainly focusing on China and the Indo-Pacific. Please lead the conversation, maybe 15 minutes or 17 minutes or so.
Thank you very much. Now, let me just take a step back and look at what we have heard about China so far. We've had a fair bit of discussion about what lessons China might draw from Russia's assault on Ukraine and from how the war there has been going so far. We've also had a bit of discussion about the response to Russia's actions against Ukraine and how these responses might look like in China's eyes. Now, I would like to try and apply some of this to China's desire to get control over Taiwan and speculate a little bit about how that might turn out. Obviously, I would assume that for China would take a lot more time to evaluate the Ukraine conflict in order to draw its final conclusions for whatever it might apply to Taiwan. But one of the assumptions just that we haven't really discussed so far is what if China's application of military force in a Taiwan scenario were not a full-scale invasion? What if China intends or considers using military force, but mainly to deter, to coerce, so everything in the gray zone space? one of the most interesting questions here, I think, is what challenges that would pose to the US and Japan and allies in terms of how to respond. We had some discussion earlier about whether the Western and international response to Russia's attack on Ukraine was strong or weak. From a certain angle, you could argue, of course, there was strong response because we've seen comprehensive sanctions on Russia. But from another angle, you could argue it is weak because Russia has broken the taboo of launching a war in Europe without having a third country entering that war and on the side of the attack party. All of these lessons obviously apply to Taiwan. So I would like to ask Professor Nye the following question: if we assume that China were to try and apply military force to Taiwan very, very gradually, starting with partial, not a full blockade, but with partial restrictive moves like a trade quarantine. What would be the threshold for the US and its allies to consider intervening, and how would deterrence or how could deterrence work in a scenario like that? How do you put the burden of escalation back on China in a scenario like that?
Well, it's an important question. If you look back on the Cuban Missile Crisis, what was interesting is that the first responses which Kennedy's advisors gave him was a preemptive strike or something which would stop it. Kennedy decided to use a way of using an embargo or blockade, and so that the Russians had, or the Soviets had to take the escalatory risk of breaking it. You might imagine something analogous to that in the case of China. In other words, if China sets up a blockade of Taiwan's ports, it seems to me important that we make clear that we're going to try to get our ships through. You might have to escort some tankers or freighters to get through. You say, well, but isn't that extremely risky? But if you look back on going to your Ukraine example, the fact that we didn't do more in 2014 when the Ukraine war first started and when Putin seized Crimea didn't save us in the end. It just encouraged him. He thought he would take Kyiv the way the Soviets took Budapest or Prague, and there'd be complaints, there'd be sanctions, but then it'll all go away. And I think in that sense, the fact that we didn't take a stronger response in 2014 was a mistake. And I think the same would be true that if China tried to blockade Taiwan in terms of not allowing trade through, that we should make sure that some of our ships, perhaps you start it with a freighter or something, try to get through, and then the Chinese have the question, are they going to sink the ship? And I think if they do, then they have this problem of facing the question of escalation. So I think it's going to take, people should be doing some planning, some wargaming about this in Washington and discussing it with our allies in Tokyo and elsewhere. But I think it would be a mistake just to allow the Chinese to squeeze Taiwan and not have any response.
Just to follow up on this very directly, we saw in August a round of Chinese exercises in the vicinity of Taiwan, and we have actually been seeing a higher level of Chinese military presence and activity around Taiwan since then. And Chinese military scholars themselves have been arguing in Chinese state media that they are successfully changing their level of activity and control around Taiwan, and have boasted that they obliterated the Taiwan Strait median line, meaning that they're very consciously changing the status quo. So even absent a blockade, what do we do if China stages another exercise like this next summer and maybe tries to make this a regular event, an exercise that looked very much like a rehearsal for a blockade? Do you think there is a kind of lowest threshold where we also need a pushback from the US or its allies?
Well, if you're talking about flying into the air defense identification zone, I think the answer to that is to basically say we don't accept this, but this is not a casus belli. It's not the same as trying to blockade Taiwan's ports. In other words, what we should do is continue with business as normal with Taiwan to make sure that gestures that China is making in the Andes, it doesn't have any effect in terms of Taiwan's trade. If, on the other hand, the Chinese decide to drop missiles into areas, sea lanes, that would have the effect of blockading Taiwan, then I think we should treat that very seriously. And I would say we wind up going ahead with this plan of sending ships to ports in Taiwan. And I think so it depends on, the Chinese are probably going to try to squeeze Taiwan one way or the other. But I would argue that for us, it's important not to accept the squeeze.
Now, I would like you to take a big step back from this very concrete scenario. And I was very interested in a piece you wrote recently that discussed whether the war we currently have in Ukraine was inevitable. And you went through discussing the deep and the intermediate and the immediate causes of that war. And, would you mind applying that framework to a war between the US and China in the Asia-Pacific? Is that kind of war inevitable? And what are the causes, and where are we now on that scale?
Well, one of the purposes of the column I did for Project Syndicate was to say that war is never inevitable, but sometimes the belief in inevitability can increase its probability. And people have gone back and forth over the history of World War I. They still write about it more than a century later. And there's usually a feeling that people have, or many people have, well, World War I was inevitable. The general view of what's inevitable or not is too deterministic. I have a colleague at Harvard who entitled a book about U.S.-China prospects for war, and the title of the book is Destined for War. And he argued it's because of what he called the Thucydides trap, which was the origins of the famous Peloponnesian War, where the Greek city-state system tore itself apart, was the rise in the power of Athens and the fear it created in Sparta. People say, well, then World War I was the rise in the power of Germany and the fear it created in Britain. And the cause of the US-China war will be the rise in the power of China and the fear it creates in Washington. This is much too simplistic. That is what I call a deep cause, that the rise of a new state and an existing hegemon, that's a background condition. But there are intermediate conditions and precipitating causes that are equally important. I've used the metaphor in this article about building a fire. You can pile up logs, you can put small kindling and paper underneath the logs, and you can strike a match which lights the fire. And the logs essentially are the deep causes, the kindling and the paper are the intermediate causes, and then the striking the match is the precipitating cause. But the important thing to realize is that even if you think that's inevitable, suppose there's a rainstorm and the kindling gets too wet, or suppose the wind comes and blows out the match before it can be touched. And Christopher Walker, a historian who's looked at World War I very, very closely and wrote a book, a very good book called The Sleepwalkers, came to the conclusion that even though the causes were beginning to pile up, even in August 1914, it was not inevitable. It depended on bad policy choices, which could have gone in other directions. So I think the moral of the story, or the lesson of the story, is we should not think that a Thucydides trap is meaning that we are destined for war. There are lots of other things in between that has to happen. And the key question is how do we handle the situation to make sure that at the period when the probabilities are highest, that we have wise policy decisions not to strike the match. And I think that's possible in the U.S.-China relations. We're going to have intense competition with China, but I still think, along with former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, that it can be what he calls managed competition. And managed competition means that you're very careful about not striking matches.
Yeah, I certainly would have a dozen more questions to ask you, but I'm mindful of the time, so maybe I'll hand it back to Akita-san.
If you, sorry, もし
If you have one more burning question, of course you can ask that. But for the time being, do you have any questions? Burning question?
The obvious one, the Chinese Communist Party is holding its 20th Party Congress in Beijing as we speak. Looking at the security issues that are of concern to us here, what do you make of Xi Jinping's report to the Party Congress and having him around for another 5 years and probably much longer than that? What does that mean for the region and Japan and its allies?
Well, I think we have to take seriously what Xi said in his opening statement, which is their intention to try to recapture Taiwan is to be taken seriously. But whatever their intentions, we can do something about the capabilities. So our ability to strengthen Taiwan's capacity for self-defense, the so-called porcupine strategy, and our ability to increase our own naval capacities, and above all, our close cooperation with Japan, and having Japan make statements and take actions along the lines that Admiral Ruffhead was talking about, can have a very powerful deterrent effect. In other words, even if Xi Jinping sees this as a goal, we can push him out to the point where he says, if I try to take this goal prematurely, it's one of the few things that can shorten my tenure from lifetime tenure to being overthrown. So we have to make sure that we create a situation that if he really is interested in preserving his power for a decade or more, it has to be made clear to him that the risk of trying to take Taiwan is so high that this is one of the few things that could lead to the end of his tenure. And there are things we can do, such as I just mentioned, to increase that risk to him.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Now, this is going to be a last exchange, last round. Maybe could we go over 3 minutes or so? I am looking at Kato-san and he's nodding. So with their permission, we may go overboard 3 minutes. Actually, we received questions in advance, and if I ask one by one, it takes 1 hour. So from my part, I use my own recipe, and I would like to combine all those questions. And I have 2 questions. And regarding Japan, we discussed a lot in the previous sessions. So I have 2 questions. One is the U.S. political division, the impact upon the alliance. Professor Nye said that U.S. division or the isolationism didn't start just now because there were a civil war in the past. Monroe Principle was taken, and also before the World War II, that U.S. was very cautious in declaring war. However, there was a Pearl Harbor attack by Japan, so U.S. came to war. So the U.S. division or isolationism does not start just now. It has a long history. I understand that, but my question is as follows. To this extent, the political division is seen in the U.S. Between progressivism and also Trumpians. So we know that the U.S. is going to be more severe vis-a-vis the China. However, if something happens, the U.S. is going to participate in militarily, and is that really the case in the future? The U.S. is going to participate militarily?
I think yes. There are polls that have been done by the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs, or Global Affairs, I guess they call it now, which have been taken since 1972 or so. And what you find is that about 1/3 of the American people don't want to be bothered with overseas. We can call them isolationists or so forth. What's interesting in the most recent polls that have been taken, the percentage of people who say we have to be involved internationally has gone up, not down. But another way of thinking about that is that 1/3 of the American people are isolationists and have been for several decades. What's interesting is how they distribute themselves in the 2 political parties. The extreme right and the extreme left both have isolationist tendencies. But if you look at the legislation that's been passed in the current Congress, which is a very closely divided Congress, something like the CHIPS and Science Act had very strong Republican support as well as Democratic support. And if you look at the attitudes toward China, you'll find that this is one of the rare areas where both Republicans and Democrats share a common view. There are some who don't, as I mentioned, on both fringes, but the view that we have to stand up to the problem of China is a bipartisan view, and I think that's encouraging. So will there be isolationism? Yes, there always has been, always will be. Is it operationally likely to destroy a forward-leaning American foreign policy in Asia or Europe? I think no.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. This is going to be the last question. After the World War II, the US and the UK, centering around those countries, victorious countries, have become central parties in the United Nations and created various international regimes. When I was a young journalist, the Japanese diplomatic principle are twofold, I was told. One is the Japan-US alliance. This is still continuing. The other is the United Nations centrism. We have to be centered around the United Nations. However, the United Nations is not functional anymore. It has collapsed, some people say. Particularly China and Russia, as members of the permanent member of the Security Council, it's difficult for the UN to regain functions. Usually, the major war occurs and the international system collapses. And then the war-winning countries would create international organizations from scratch, like United Nations. However, it is very difficult to reset after a major war. Then, if that's the case, the international organizations in the post-war era, centering around the United Nations, they are completely in paralysis. How are we going to respond to dysfunction of these international organizations? Could Japan and the United States, how could we respond to that?
First of all, to go back again to something that Jim Steinberg mentioned, we have to think of institutional defenses in layers. Or concentric circles. And the most important of the circles are going to be our bilateral and multilateral alliances. In the case of Asia, it'll be our alliance with Japan, as well as with Korea and Australia and so forth. But that doesn't mean we dismiss the outermost circle, which is the UN. UN is paralyzed when one of the 5 veto powers refuses to go along with something. But let's not forget that that was the case in the UN between 1950 and the 1990s. There was no resolution under Chapter 7 of the UN once the Soviets discovered they'd made a mistake boycotting the Security Council meeting on Korea in June of 1950. It was only when the Cold War ended and Gorbachev changed Soviet policy that the Soviets actually allowed the UN to pass a resolution under Chapter 7, which authorized the Gulf War. So we've been through long periods in which the UN has been paralyzed at the Security Council level. Nonetheless, there have been innovations such as United Nations peacekeeping. There have been various specialized agencies that have helped on a variety of tasks related to particular issues. And so I think we should not have illusions that the UN is going to solve problems, but we should not, we'd be ignoring history if we said the UN is useless because the countries which have veto power are using it. Another way of putting it is that when the the Charter was written, somebody said that the veto by the 5 veto powers was like a fuse in an electrical system. When the fuse was overloaded, the lights went out, but that's better than having the house burned down. And you still have the basic norms of the UN that were agreed to after 1945. And one of the most important was that you didn't use force to steal your neighbor's territory. And the fact that Russia did use force to steal its neighbor's territory, and that you had a UN General Assembly vote just 2 weeks ago in which it was condemned by something like 143 to 5, there are things that still maintain the importance of the United Nations. So as one of the layers of institutions that the US and Japan both need to preserve, we shouldn't discard the UN.
どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. For journalists, we are after day-to-day news. So we carry out analysis based on the everyday phenomenon. But we have to look at things in a historical context. And that was something I learned today. So with this, I'd like to end this conversation. Professor Nye, Ms. Hill, thank you very much. And also my thanks go to the members of the audience. Professor Nye, Mr. Akita, Ms. Hill, thank you very much. Please give them a big round of applause once again.